Nigeria, the land of kings and queens, has always been home to warriors. But not all warriors carry swords, some wield their voices, their convictions, and their courage. Today, we unveil the story of a woman who shook the very foundations of power. A woman whose voice echoed through the streets, sending chills down the spines of oppressors. A woman who dared to defy the system, long before feminism had a name in Africa. This is the story of Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the fearless woman who refused to bow down. Before she became a thorn in the flesh of the British colonialists, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was simply Frances Abigail Olya Funmilayo Thomas. Born in 1900 in Abeokuta, present-day Ogun State, Nigeria, she was a daughter of privilege, but privilege did not make her blind. Instead, it made her wise. Unlike many girls of her time, Funmilayo was sent to school, an opportunity considered a rare gem in an era when female education was not a priority. But something changed when she went to England for further studies. There, she saw firsthand how women in Europe were fighting for their rights. Suffrage movements, protests, and public debates filled the streets. She returned to Nigeria, but she was no longer the same. A fire had been ignited in her soul, a fire that would soon engulf an entire nation. They say knowledge is power, and Funmilayo knew that education was the key to liberation. She was not just a teacher, she was a spark, a force that could ignite the minds of young girls who had been told for generations that their destiny was to serve in silence. But the deeper she delved into teaching, the more she saw a disturbing pattern. Nigerian women, brilliant, hardworking, and resilient, were being relegated to the background. It was not just about education, it was about an entire system designed to suppress their voices. Society told them their place was in the home, to be seen but never heard. They could carry the weight of entire households, but not the weight of leadership. They could raise future leaders, but never be leaders themselves. And Funmilayo? She wasn't having any of it. She realized that knowledge had to extend beyond the classroom. It had to spill into the streets, into the markets, into the very fabric of society. She began speaking up, not just to children, but to mothers, to wives, to daughters. She told them they were more than just caretakers. That their hands, which carried baskets of goods and cradled infants, were also strong enough to shape the future. At first, her words were met with skepticism. Women had been conditioned to accept their silence. But Funmilayo was patient. She knew revolutions do not happen overnight. So, she started small gatherings in homes, quiet discussions at markets, whispered conversations behind closed doors. What started as informal discussions soon became structured meetings. What began as a handful of women became dozens. Then hundreds. Then thousands. The ripple effect was undeniable. Women who had never dared to question their oppression began to rise. They found their voices. They found their courage. And in Funmilayo, they found a leader. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a movement. And the world was about to witness the full force of her revolution. The war against taxation. Then came the straw that broke the camel's back, the unjust taxation of women in Abeokuta. For years, men had been burdened with colonial taxes, squeezed dry by an administration that saw them as nothing more than sources of revenue. But now, it was the women, the backbone of the local economy, the ones who fed families and kept communities alive, who were being crushed under the weight of an oppressive system. The colonial government, through the Elake of Egbaland, imposed heavy taxes on market women, claiming it was necessary for economic development. But development for whom? Certainly not for the women who spent endless hours under the scorching sun, selling their goods just to make ends meet. Certainly not for the mothers who barely had enough to feed their children. And so, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, alongside thousands of these women, had had enough. And so, the Abeokuta Women's Union was born. What started as a few dozen voices soon became a thunderous chorus of over 20,000 women. They marched. They protested. They stormed government offices, chanting in one voice, "Enough is enough." When the colonial government and local chiefs ignored them, the women did something radical, something unthinkable. They occupied the palace, refused to leave, and demanded justice. They camped outside for days, sleeping on mats, cooking in makeshift fire pits, their voices never wavering. The protests grew louder. The colonial authorities watched, unsure of how to handle a rebellion of women. Arresting them would only fuel the fire. Ignoring them was no longer an option. Days turned into weeks. The streets of Abeokuta had never seen anything like this before. The colonial government was losing control. The Alake of Egbaland, once confident, once untouchable, now found himself trapped in his own palace, his authority crumbling with each passing day. Then, the unthinkable happened. The Alake of Egbaland, under immense pressure from the women and the growing political unrest, was forced to abdicate his throne. A king had fallen, not by the sword, not by war, but by the sheer power of women who refused to be silent. This wasn't just a victory. It was a revolution. For the first time in Nigeria's history, women had proven that they were not weak, that they were not invisible, that they could shake the very foundations of power. And this was just the beginning. But her fight didn't stop there. The battle against unfair taxation was just the beginning. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti had shaken the foundations of local rule, but she had her sights set on something even bigger: Nigeria's independence. The colonial government had controlled her people for far too long. She knew the time had come to demand freedom. And so, she stepped into a new battlefield. No longer just a teacher. No longer just an activist. She became a political force, a woman who understood that real change required strategy, alliances, and most of all, courage. She traveled across Africa, rallying support for anti-colonial movements. She visited the United Kingdom, challenging British authorities on their treatment of Nigerians. And then, she did something that made the colonial government's blood run cold: she went to the Soviet Union. The British viewed the Soviet Union as a dangerous communist stronghold, a breeding ground for rebellion. When Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti visited, engaging with leaders and thinkers, the British government branded her a radical. To them, she was no longer just a woman demanding rights, she was a threat to their empire. Reports of her activities reached British officials. To them, she was dangerous, uncontrollable, a troublemaker who refused to be silenced. But what terrified them most? She wasn't acting alone. She had an army of voices behind her, a people who were beginning to realize their power. It wasn't just the British who feared her. The Nigerian elite, the men who had benefited from colonial rule, who saw power slipping through their fingers, saw her as a problem. She didn't fit their mold of what a Nigerian woman should be. She was loud when they expected silence. She was defiant when they demanded obedience. But while the British saw her as a troublemaker, and the Nigerian elite saw her as a threat, the people, they saw her as their voice. She spoke for the market women who were overtaxed. She spoke for the men who were overworked and underpaid. She spoke for the youth who had dreams of an independent Nigeria, free from colonial rule. And so, the British watched her every move. They followed her, interrogated her, and even tried to suppress her influence. But how do you silence a movement fueled by justice? Despite threats, arrests, and intimidation, Funmilayo never wavered. She knew that movements were bigger than individuals, that revolutions did not begin or end with one person. So, she did what all great leaders do: she passed the torch. She mentored a new generation of freedom fighters. Young men and women who had seen the weight of oppression and now carried her vision forward. And among them was someone who would shake the world in his own way, her own son, Funmilayo Kuti. Funmilayo inherited his mother's fire. But instead of protests in the streets, he took the battle to a different stage: his music. Through Afrobeat, he challenged corrupt governments, exposed oppression, and spoke for the people, just as his mother had done before him. The world saw Fila's defiance, but many never knew where it came from. It was Funmilayo's voice that echoed through his music, her spirit that lived in every lyric, every beat, every protest anthem. But even the strongest warriors face their final battle. In 1978, under Nigeria's brutal military dictatorship, soldiers raided the Kalakita Republic, the communal home of Fela Kuti and his family. The attack was vicious, an all-out assault ordered by a government that saw Fela's music and activism as a threat. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the fearless warrior who had stood against colonial rule, who had defied kings and empires, was thrown from a second-story window. The woman who had once led thousands into battle was now lying wounded, her body battered by the very forces she had fought against her entire life. Weeks later, she succumbed to her injuries. Nigeria had lost a legend. But even in death, she remained a symbol of defiance. Her story did not end with her death. It lives in every woman who dares to challenge oppression. In every activist who refuses to be silenced. In every Nigerian who dreams of justice. Today, when we speak of freedom, of resistance, of the power of a single voice, we speak of Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the woman who refused to bow. Why her story matters today. Today, when Nigerian women take to the streets, when they demand justice, when they refuse to be silenced, they are walking in the footsteps of Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti. She was more than a woman, she was a force, a movement, a revolution. And if she were alive today, she would remind us, the fight is never over. Keep marching, keep speaking, keep rising. If this story inspired you, share it. Let the world know about the fearless woman who stood against oppression. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more historic stories from great empires and leaders, make sure to subscribe to NaijaTrends TV. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the rich history of our world. Until next time, stay bold, stay fearless, keep history alive.